Welcome back to Beyond Sunday School. It's been a few crazy weeks, and we've got 2 more weeks left of this session on the history of the monarchy of Israel. And we will by next Wednesday we'll have some idea of where we're going to go next. We're going to continue to do biblical history and looking at some of those different things that give us the historical context of the Bible. So that's kind of where we're going to head after we wrap up the Southern Kingdom next Wednesday. This week, we are looking at the Northern Kingdom, and we're going to be kind of all over First and Second Kings, and we're going to focus on the kings of the North and the history of Israel, which is at this point in the Bible refers to the 10 northern tribes. So next week, when we look at Judah, the kingdom of Judah, we're talking basically about Judah and Benjamin, those two southern tribes. So that's kind of where we're headed. So let me. One other thing: if you're listening or watching this after Wednesday when we record it live, you may hear some voices. You may hear some background noise and conversations and different things, and that's because we do record this live. And so some of my friends who are on here may interrupt and ask questions, and they are probably questions that are running through your head. So hopefully that is helpful. But that's why you'll hear some extra voices. And if you want to be a part of a live recording, just send me a message and let me know, and I will make sure to get you the link to our Zoom broadcast. So let me pray, and then we will dive into 1 Kings 12 through 22 through 2 Kings chapter 17 is kind of where we're headed. So let me pray. God, thanks for tonight. Thank you for time to gather as your people here, to spend a little bit of time looking at history to help us ground our understanding of the Bible in its historical context. And as we do, would you help move us to the place where we will be changed a little bit as we study the scriptures, and that this would not just simply become more information. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Hey, so we're here in looking at the Northern Kingdom. Our focus is on these northern kings. So where we ended last time is Solomon. At the end of Solomon's life, the kingdom of Israel was an empire. It had reached really its full geographic scope to the area of the promised land that God had promised Abraham, and well beyond. So it had become a world player. There was nothing about Israel that was small time near at the end of Solomon's life. And so you would think that things would just kind of continue on. The problem, though, is that that's not how it went down. We move into some really bad nighttime TV drama kind of things, soap opera kind of stuff here. And we get into things that look more like the Game of Thrones than what we would expect to find in the Bible. And it's the stories here in the second half of First Kings and into Second Kings are the kinds of stories that sometimes make you take your Bible, and as you're reading it, you kind of close it and you pick it up and you look at the spine to make sure it really is the Bible, because there are stories of assassinations and murder plots and just all kinds of craziness. And that's just in the Northern Kingdom. So, it's a wild time in the life of the people of God. So we dive in here at the end. Solomon dies, and he has, the division of the kingdom happens almost immediately. So in we have this prediction that God makes to Jeroboam through the prophet Ahijah, and that the tribes would come apart, that the kingdom would fall apart. But this the roots of division, if you remember, even like all the way from the very beginning, from Saul all the way through Solomon, there was always this concern of the kings to try to figure out how do we unite these tribes? How do we unite these 12 tribes? And the seeds of this division they go all the way back. The tribes of Judah and Ephraim had significant rivalry all the way back to the time of Egypt. Judah was the largest, and it had been honored by God. Judah was always the first tribe out when they broke camp. So they had this position of leadership, and Ephraim was one of the smaller tribes. And so there was just this significant jealousy between Ephraim and Judah. In the Judges period, we see the story of Gideon and Jephthah, and each time Ephraim kind of comes out and says, "Hey, we're not getting our props for the role we played in these battles. We're not getting we're not getting the recognition we deserve." And so you have there's just this tension here. And so, you have God picking Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is stuck right in between Ephraim and Judah. So it's kind of the strategic pick by God, in a sense of, hey, here's from the smallest tribe. I'm going to pick the king, and hopefully this can unite it. And Saul does some good there, but it just doesn't work itself out ever. And so when we get into 1 Kings chapter 12, we have Rehoboam, who is he's supposed to be the new king. He's supposed to take Solomon's place. He's the anointed one. He's the one that's supposed to be coming. And so they decide, hey, let's get together. And Rehoboam knew that, this was problematic. Like, there was this tension. He was aware of it. And so what he does in his as he's stepping into the throne, he says, okay, let's do the coronation at Shechem, not in Jerusalem. The normal way of things, I mean, the seat of power, the palace where the king was going to reign, was in Jerusalem. And so everybody should have come there to pay tribute, to pay honor, to celebrate the coronation of the new king. But Rehoboam says, well, there's this tension, there's this problem with the north. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Shechem, and let's do this there. And Shechem was probably selected because it was central ground for the 10 northern tribes that were upset, and it had historical significance for them. So, this was a pretty shrewd move on behalf of Rehoboam. The problem is his counterpart, the other son vying for the throne, was Jeroboam, and he says, okay. And Jeroboam had to avoid Rehoboam's wrath, he went out to Egypt, and so he comes back, and he shows up at the meeting because he had been appointed by, or he had been asked to come by the by the northern tribes. And so here he shows up, and so these northern tribes wanted something really specific from Rehoboam. They wanted most of Solomon's measures, the things that he had kind of put in place. They wanted those things rolled back, right? The forced labor, the oppressive tax laws. They wanted all of that reduced. They wanted that pushed back to the way it was under David. Because remember, Solomon had this massive building plan where he built a temple and he built all these buildings and fortresses and different things. And to do so, he had to tax the people in exorbitant ways, oppressive taxation. Then he was conscripting laborers from within Israel. And so you had forced labor. So, the northern tribes there's a ton of them and only, two of the southern tribes. And so they were holding on, they're taking the brunt of all of this and said, yo, we need you guys to back this off. So what does Rehoboam do? Well, he gets with the old advisors, Solomon's advisors. And they say, yeah, this is good. You should roll this stuff back. Then Rehoboam goes and talks to his peers, the young guys. And the young guys are like, no, you need to be strong. You give them an inch now, they're going to take a mile. So who does Rehoboam trust? Who does he side with? The young guys. And what happens? It all falls apart. And we see this in 1 Kings chapter 12. In verse 12, so here's the advice, right? Here's the advice that the elders gave him in verse 7. They said, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. And in verse 10, it says, young men replied who had grown up with him, said, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam as the king had said, come back to me in 3 days. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to him, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel, look after your own house, David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. So we see this split here in the house, between north and south. And so Jeroboam then takes charge of the north, and he becomes the guy. So, in verse 25, we see what happens as Jeroboam begins to take power. It says, then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. So he's setting all of this up. He's fortifying things in the north, but he's got this religious problem. The religious problem that the temple is in Jerusalem, and Rehoboam is reigning out of Jerusalem. And so his worry is that when they go up to worship, when they go to offer their sacrifices, when the people of Israel go to celebrate the feasts. They're going to be reminded of the glory of Solomon. They're going to be reminded of the glory of the temple. They're going to be reminded of the glory of God. And they're going to say, oh, what were we thinking? This is God's anointed one. We got to stay here. We got to serve him. So, Rehoboam, or, these guys' names, Jeroboam, you're kicked to the curb. Jeroboam didn't want that. So because of this religious problem, what does he do? How does he solidify power? Verse 28, after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel, he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. So in the name of power, in the name of securing power of a religious people, do you see what he's doing? Is he's saying, okay, they have this religious desire. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it easier and better for them. I'm going to make their religion easier and better. They don't have to travel all the way to Jerusalem. No, they can stay up here in the north. I'm going to set up these 2 places, Bethel and Dan, Bethel in the southern part, Dan in the northern region, and they can go worship there. And he creates his own festivals so they can have the feasts and they can do all of this stuff. And so what we have now is this is the very foundation for why when we get into the New Testament, you have in the Gospels them talking about, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? The Samaritans are the people from the north. Like this is who they are. They are the northern tribes of Israel, and so they are worshiping on their mountain that Jeroboam set up, and not at Jerusalem. And this is where that came from. That's why they worshiped God the way they did. So now, not only do you have a political separation, you now have a religious separation. And the people follow their king. He is worshiping God as the anointed one from God and saying, this is how we now worship in the north. Well, as you might imagine, God was not a fan. He was not a fan of this at all. And in chapter 13, he is straight rebuked. And in 14, he is rebuked. In 13, he is rebuked. Before we get there, the other thing to notice about this worship that he institutes is it wasn't overseen by the Levites. Why? Because the Levites were in Jerusalem. They were serving at the temple. So there were no Levites serving in the north. So what does he do? He just gets regular old people and say, hey, you want to be a priest? You're a priest. So now he's also created this other class of people who now are faithful to him because he's installed them with religious power. So he's super smart. I mean, this is, if you want to create a new kingdom from a monotheistic people, what you're going to do is you're going to fortify things militarily, but then you're also going to create this new religion and try to tie it back into their old traditions. And he does this very effectively. So this is a pretty smart this is a pretty smart move by him. And so then God, of course, is not happy, because this is not the way it's supposed to go. There is only one God, and they should only worship at the temple, and they should only offer sacrifices at the temple, and they need to follow the scriptures, and the Levites need to do their thing. This is how it's supposed to work. But Jeroboam says, no, I'm going to do it my own way. And so he is rebuked. First, he is rebuked by the man of God from Judah. We don't have a name. We don't know who it is. He's simply known as the man of God from Judah. And that story takes place in 1 Kings 13. And so, what do we see here? Well, he is in direct violation of the Mosaic covenant, and he is introducing false gods, false worship. And so this man of Judah, he shows up and he speaks against the Bethel altar and predicts that a prince of the rival house of David, whose name would be Josiah, would one day burn the bones of Jeroboam's priests upon that very altar. That's in 1 Kings 13, 1-3. And we see that come to fruition later on in 2 Kings 23. So he loses. Jeroboam gets super angry, and he points and says, hey, someone sees this guy. But when he points, his hand shrivels up. So then he says, hey, fix my hand. The messenger of God calls out, and his hand is restored. Now, what happens, after that point? We don't really know. He must have rethought it, but he must have rethought his religious program. But we don't see any changes from that. So then in 14, 1-18, we get the story of Jeroboam's son Abijah, who becomes ill. And so Jeroboam says to his wife, this is verse 2, he says, go disguise yourself so you won't be recognized as the wife of Jeroboam. Then go to Shiloh. Ahijah the prophet is there, the one who told me I would be king over this people. Take 10 loaves of bread with you, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy. So Jeroboam's wife did what he said and went to Ahijah's house in Shiloh. Now, he's thinking, hey, this dude prophesied that I would be king. This is great. He's on my side. He's with me. So he's going to tell me what I want to hear. He's going to go on behalf of God. I mean, good grief. He's feeding the guy, right? The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And so he sends his wife with good food, and he's expecting to get the news that he wants to hear. It says, now Ahijah could not see. His sight was gone because of his age. But the Lord had told Ahijah, Jeroboam's wife is coming to ask you about her son, for he is ill. And you are to give her such and such an answer. When she arrives, she'll pretend to be someone else. So when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps at the door, he said, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why this pretense? I have been sent to you with bad news. Go tell Jeroboam, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. I raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have aroused my anger and turned your back on me. Because of this, I am going to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it is all gone. Dogs will eat those belonging to Jeroboam who die in the city, and the birds will feed on those who die in the country. The Lord has spoken. As for you, go back home. When you set foot in your city, the boy will die. All Israel will mourn for him and bury him. He is the only one belonging to Jeroboam who will be buried, because he's the only one in the house of Jeroboam in whom the Lord, the God of Israel, has found anything good. I mean, that is some tough stuff. You have done more evil than all who have come before you. Now, I mean, let's recall that we had the flood. I mean, we had Adam and Eve. There's been a lot of bad stuff that have gone on. But, Jeroboam, he says, you have done, you're the worst. And he says, it's coming. It's going to all fall apart. It's all going to fall apart. So what does Jeroboam discover? He discovers that the prophet of God is not concerned about the court. He's not concerned about currying favor with any king. He is concerned with the word of God and obeying the word of God and calling the people of God, including the king, to account. So the end is coming. As we progress through Jeroboam's reign, it was a catastrophic reign. His leadership was terrible. There was a significant loss of territory. He loses all kinds of places. He loses Damascus in the north. He lost, he loses areas in the southwest to the Philistines. It is shrinking. The north is shrinking, and things are beginning to fall apart. And so, he loses Gibeon. He loses Moab. It's just kind of an abject failure from the beginning. And the problem with this was, with him being such a weak leader, with his failure imminent, we also begin to see the rise of this guy named Rezon, an Aramaean state in Damascus, who just causes all kinds of problems for a while as Assyria begins its rise. At the end of chapter 14, we get 19 through 20. There we get his death. This is the other events of Jeroboam's reign. His wars, how he ruled, are written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel. He reigned for 22 years and then rested with his ancestors. And Nadab, his son, succeeded him as king. Nadab reigns for 2 years. And his only recorded, the only good thing that he did was he sieged Gibbethon in Philistine territory, which his father had lost. That was kind of his only thing of note. And, he's just not that great of a guy. What we get in verse 26 in his introduction is this: Nadab, son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah. He reigned over Israel 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father and committing the same sin his father had caused Israel to commit.
Dan?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It often says these things are written in the annals of the kings of Israel. Are those things, do they still exist, or are they gone?
They're gone as far as we know.
Okay.
Yep. So, each king, they kind of kept a record of, they kept written records. And so what most scholars think happened is when Israel was sacked, those things were all burned and destroyed. Because
I've been wondering that too.
Yeah.
Because you don't want, if you're an invading army, and if you're taking over another country, you don't want their old king's exploits being known, right? You don't want the people to have hope of another king of such and such who could possibly rise up, right? So they say that history is written by the victors, and this is one of those ways, where you're able to eliminate, in some sense, the history of the losers. And so we have these stories, because these were probably written, during the exile, to explain to the people why they were in exile. You get a couple generations in and people forget, why are we in exile? Why is this happening? And so you probably had you had scholars, you had religious scholars of their time sitting down and saying, okay, we need to write these histories down. We need to tell the story of why we're in exile. And that's why First and Second Kings is so negative. It's such a downer. These kings were just like, you get all the bad stuff. But then you read First and Second Chronicles and they're kind of happy, or not, maybe not happy, but the kings weren't as painted in as bad a light in First and Second Chronicles because those were written after the exile. So, they're written to say, hey, this is why we got to come out of exile. See, if you follow God's ways, we have success and we're not going to be in exile. Does that make sense?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
So Nadab shows up, lasts for a couple of years. And this phrase, he followed in the way of his father, committing the same sin. This is the repeated deal. Like, there just weren't any good northern kings. All 18 rulers of the northern kingdom continued some form of substitute worship, and God held it against each of them, as we might expect. So the next king who shows up in the north is Baasha. And, he reigned for 24 years. And we get his introduction in 1533. It says, in the third year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, son of Ahijah, became king of all Israel in Tirzah. And he reigned 24 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. So, he was not a good dude. He continued the same kind of stuff. He reigned for a while, and he went to war. He went to war with had some issues with other guys. He just wasn't that great. 16 verse 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to Jehu, son of Hanani, concerning Baasha. I lifted you up from the dust and appointed you ruler over my people Israel, but you followed the ways of Jeroboam and caused my people Israel to sin, to arouse my anger. So I am about to wipe out Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like that of Jeroboam. Dogs will eat those belonging to Baasha who die in the city. Birds will feed on those. And that was kind of it. He just wasn't a great guy. And then we get the next couple of kings, Elah and Zimri. So Elah succeeded his father, Baasha, and he ruled all of 2 years. He tried to get Gibbethon again. We pick his story up in chapter 16, verse 8. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, son of Baasha, became king. Zimri, one of his officials, who had command of half his chariots, plotted against him. Elah was in Tirzah at the time, getting drunk in the home of Arza, the palace administrator of Tirzah. I mean, these stories, it really does sound like the Game of Thrones. I mean, it sounds like something you would see on TV. And so here he is, he's getting drunk. Verse 10, Zimri came in, struck him down, killed him. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, then he succeeded him as king. As soon as he began to reign and was seated on the throne, he killed off Baasha's whole family. He did not spare a single male, whether relative or friend. So Zimri destroyed the whole family of Baasha in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken against Baasha through the prophet Jehu, because of all the sins Baasha and his son Elah had committed and had caused Israel to commit. So they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. As for the events of Elah's reign and all he did, they're written. In the 27th year, Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned in Tirzah 7 days. 7 days. My man made it a whole week. So what happened to him? Well, when the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day there in the camp. Then Omri and all the Israelites with him withdrew from Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah. So we have a civil war going on. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him, so he died. He committed suicide. So we go from assassination to a coup to suicide in what, a week? A week. This is God's people. This is the history of the people of God. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's crazy. So now Omri shows up. Now, Omri, if you remember, as we were looking through Micah, there was at one point near the end where Micah says, hey, you guys are following in the lavish excess, basically, of your kings, Omri and Ahab. Now we're getting into their story. We're going to find out how bad these dudes were. So, what we get here with Omri, is just not great stuff. This is kind of the new dynasty, right? He's replaced all of Jeroboam. Jeroboam's folks are gone now, so we've transitioned into this new dynasty, the dynasty of Omri, and he must have been a very good king in the political and power sense, because we found like some archaeological digs that they found refer to Israel as the land of Omri, and those are dated to a few hundred years after Omri. So his shadow was big. He was a guy who had some skill, had some political savvy, had some military might, he was a capable political ruler. So what we get here in verse 21 of chapter 16, it says, then the people of Israel were split into two factions. Half supported Tibni, son of Gineth, for king. The other half supported Omri. Omri's followers proved stronger than those of Tibni. So Tibni died. How did he die? So Tibni died, and Omri became king in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah. So we've now gone through how many kings since Asa took over? I mean, it's crazy. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're on our 5th king. And Judah, on the other hand, has had all this stability in their kings. And what's the difference? So we're going to find out that it's not that the kings of Judah were necessarily all that great, but the difference was the fact that those kings, by and large, tried to keep temple worship going. They tried to keep a proper and right worship of God. Everything is going to come back to that. Everything is going to come back to this false worship that got brought in by Jeroboam in the north. And that's why they fall first. So in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri becomes king, and he reigned 12 years, 6 of them in Tirzah. He bought the hill of Samaria from Shamer for 2 talents of silver and built a city on the hill, calling it Samaria. And now you know the rest of the story. This is where the name the Samaritans comes from. This is exactly the point where they're Israel, yes, the north, but the slur that the south used for them, Samaritans. And it's because of this moment here. It says, but Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. there were some really bad guys before him. We've covered them all already, right? Jeroboam had done nobody had been as bad as him. And now Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, sinned more than all those before him. He followed completely the ways of Jeroboam, completely the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, committing the same sin had caused Israel to commit, so that they aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, by their worthless idols. I mean, bad dude, but yet he still did some, he was a pretty good political ruler that we catch from these other places in history, specifically from Assyria. So right now, just so you guys can kind of place this timeline, Omri is ruling in Israel starting in about 885. And at this point, Assyria is starting to rise to power. And their ruler was a guy named Ashur-nasir-pal II, and he was super cruel and pretty evil. It's his annals that we have are just they will curl your socks. And so it's at this point that the Assyrian Empire has begun. He starts marching. He catches, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre on the Mediterranean, and this is where while Omri's ruling in his 12 years. So you have the rise of this new empire, and Omri is just trying to hang on. And this is who referred to Israel as the land of Omri, because he was pretty strong. We know from something called the Moabite stone that Omri had conquered Moab, and so we know that. So he was a pretty cagey fella. We also know that Omri married off his son Ahab to Jezebel, who is a Phoenician princess. So he's made this, political alliance now with him and another power. So he's trying to kind of rebuild this Israeli empire. So there was some good stuff from Phoenicia. They were able to get, some, cedar and all kinds of other stuff. And Phoenicia was able to get grain and oil, olive oil. So this was good things. But there's always a but. And the but is this: Jezebel was a really strong person. And what did she bring? She brought her gods. She brought her religion. She is the one that brings Baal worship into the heart of Israel. And so we get Ahab and Jezebel's story. Ahab reigns. We get the beginning of him here in chapter 16, verse 29. It says, in the 38th year, so we still have only one king in Judah, Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. He reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, and that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole, did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. In Ahab's time, Hill of Bethel rebuilt Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son, Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his second son, Segub, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. So there's all kinds of bad stuff happening here. And there's no wonder then why at this moment in time, you have, you have the rise of arguably the single most important prophet in the history of the people of God. You have the rise of Elijah, and most of the narrative about the reign of Ahab is talking about Elijah and how he is calling the people out and how he is calling them to account. So you have Elijah, who is just doing all these, who's kind of working in the background. You have Ahab and Jezebel, who are leading the people astray. We find out, in 1 Kings 20, that he was. We learn that this guy Ahab was probably a pretty good military leader. So he was a capable ruler. He built a ton of stuff. In Amos 3, Amos critiques Ahab about his ivory palace that he built. So he's doing a lot of good things. He's also able to strike an alliance with Judah. I mean, this is under Ahab, as evil as he was, because he was evil. In a lot of ways, he was super successful. There was some peace, there was prosperity, and yet all the while, the people, the religion, the faith is going down deeper. It's getting worse. So you have Elijah comes on the scene, right? And you have the famous stories, of Elijah, who causes a great drought, which was a total punch in the face to Baal. Baal was considered to be the god of the harvest and the rains. And so what does God do? God sends a drought and says, make it rain, buddy. Got nothing? Oh, okay. And then you get Elijah on Mount Carmel, because Jezebel is out there just killing. She's killing prophets. She's killing priests. She's killing, God's messengers. So Elijah goes to Mount Carmel, and you have that famous story, saying, hey, somebody, will your gods consume this with fire or not? And the Baal prophets can't get Baal to catch the thing on fire. So what does, Elijah, he gets the whole offering together, douses it with water, and boom, God brings the fire. And at that point, they take out now you have Elijah and his guys, they wipe out the Baal prophets. And you would think that, okay, now we're on the rise. But Jezebel challenges Elijah, and he runs away and hides. And you get this whole nother story about Elijah and hearing the voice, the voice of God, and the still small voice. And you have this whole new ministry that Elijah ends up taking, and he raises up Elisha, and we see Elisha now is going to take on some prominence through the next set of kings. In chapter 20, you have Ben-Hadad from Aram. This is the guy, this is the dude who, is kind of up there in, I'm drawing a blank on the name in Damascus. So he comes down and he attacks Samaria. But Ahab is able to fight him off. So we get to see some of that. Now, you guys can read in way more detail about Ahab and the Micaiah, another prophet in chapter 22 rises up, and basically they just keep calling Ahab to account and the people of God to account, to come back to a true faith, and he keeps not doing it. In chapter 22, we get the story of how Ahab is killed, there at Ramoth in Gilead as he's fighting. And so the next northern king, we're going to start blitzing through here fast, is Ahaziah. He reigns from 853 to 852. We get his story in 2 Kings 1, 2 through 18. and still not a great situation. And then so we'll just quickly, it says, after Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel. Now Ahaziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself. So he sent messengers saying to them, go and consult with Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, go and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them. Notice he calls him the king of Samaria and no longer the king of Israel. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says: you will not leave the bed you are lying in; you will certainly die. And that's what happens. He dies, and he only reigns. He reigns what, 2 years? Ahaziah does, and after Ahaziah, and we get all kinds of Elisha stories here in Second Kings that you can read about. So Ahaziah, he dies, and then the next king of Israel is Jehu, and we get this story in chapter 9. So what does Jehu do? Well, Jehu, he does some killing. He wipes out some people, and you can read all of that in chapter 9, and it's not good. So he's a bad guy, and then we get his brother Jehoram in 2 Kings chapter 3. We get Jehoram. His story kind of pops up there, kind of bouncing all over the place because that's just how the text kind of works. And he reigns for 12 years. And in chapter 3, verse 2, so let's look at 3:1. It says, Joram, the son of Ahab, became king of Israel in Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And he reigned 12 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father and mother had done. He got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father made. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit. He did not turn away from them. So he still has this problem. Under him, you have the revolt of Moab. And then you have him dealing with the Arameans. And it's just, there's just crazy stories in here about, Samaria getting sieged in 2 Kings 6, 24 through 720. It's, he just kind of keeps rolling here. And then in 1 Kings, or in 2 Kings chapter 9, that's when we get Jehu. I kind of jumped the gun there. So you have Jehoram and then Jehu. And he's he does a lot. He does a lot of killing, right? The prophet Elisha summoned a man, tuck your cloak. Let's see if we can pick it up. Jehu got up, went into the house. Then the prophet poured oil on Jehu's head and declared, this is what the Lord of the God of Israel says. They were in chapter 9 of 2 Kings. I anoint you king over the Lord's people, Israel. You are to destroy the house of Ahab, your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. The whole house of Ahab will perish. I will cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. As for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. Then he opened the door and ran. When Jehu went out to his fellow officers, one of them asked, is everything all right? Why did this maniac come to you? You know the man and the sorts of things he says, Jehu replied. That's not true, they said. Tell us. Here's what he told me. This is what the Lord says. I anoint you king over Israel. They quickly took their cloaks and spread them under him on the bare steps, and they blew the trumpet and shouted, Jehu is king. And then the rest of chapter 9 is just kind of brutality. We at the end of chapter 9, starting in verse 30, you get Jezebel's death, if you want to read all those details. Ahab's family is wiped out in chapter 10. The servants of Baal are killed in chapter 10. Jehu just kind of goes on this killing spree, and he's kind of fulfilling prophecy, but they go beyond it. Now, the other thing that we see happens during Jehu's rule is there's some pretty significant humiliation that they go through in front of Assyria, and there is something, and we learn about this from Assyrian records in Shalmaneser III's obelisk, and what we find on that obelisk is the king of Israel. It said, and you see him bowing, and he's kind of carved in there, Jehu, the king of Israel, bowing to Assyria, to Shalmaneser. So Jehu was weak. He ended up not being a strong guy. He wiped out the house, he blood purged Omri's house. He did all that. But he just wasn't that good of a leader militarily or anything along those lines. And so then in chapter 13, we're now getting closer and closer to the exile of the north. 814 to 798, Jehoaz rules. And we don't know much about him. What we know is, that they were under the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and Ben-Hadad, his son. So these, the guys in Damascus were giving them fits, and it was problematic. He reigned 17 years, and we really just don't know much. But he's the only one where we get something good. Verse 4, Jehoaz sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram was oppressing Israel. The Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they escaped from the power of Aram. So the Israelites lived in their own homes as they had before, but they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. They continued in them. Also, the Asherah pole remained standing in Samaria. So he seeks the Lord almost as a last resort. God, in his grace, gives them relief, but they still don't turn away. 1310, we get the next king that takes us up 798 to 782, Jehoash. And, they are now making some strides to recovery because of God's grace, lifting them out from underneath the thumb of the Aramites. And so but Jehoash in 2 Kings 14, 8 through 14, he withstands an attack from Amaziah, the king of Judah. So, there's civil war erupting, and so he brings on his son Jeroboam II to reign with him as co-ruler, because he is Jehoash ends up going out to battle, and he's like, hey, he's going to battle with Judah, and so he wants to make sure there's somebody on the throne in case he dies in battle. So Jeroboam II shows up in verse 23 of chapter 14. In the 15th year of Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away from any of the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which caused Israel to commit. He was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the Dead Sea, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through the servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath Hefer. And so, verse 26, the Lord had seen how bitterly everyone in Israel, whether slave or free, was suffering. There was no one to help them. And since the Lord had not said he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash. So even though Jeroboam the second was a lousy king, still leading them into sin, God in his grace restored back much of the land. So there was this time of prosperity. Did the people deserve it? No. God gave them grace. He gave them grace. During this time of Jeroboam's reign, you get this kind of rise of some of these eighth century prophets like Jonah, Amos, Hosea. These guys were rolling. Then in 753, you get Zechariah, and the King Zechariah, and he shows up here in 2 Kings 15, 8 through 12. He didn't rule long. Within 6 months of assuming the throne, he was assassinated by his successor, Shallum. And that's all we got. So then Shallum shows up, who kills Zechariah, and he reigns 1 month. He reigns a whole month. Menahem takes him out, probably in retaliation for that guy killing, for Shallum killing Zechariah. And so Menahem rules for 10 years. And, he's getting ready to go he has to deal with Tiglath-Pileser, who, was really kind of brings it to a fore. 742 to 740, you get Pekahiah and Pekah, who reign, and you get their stories there in chapter 15 as well. Hoshea is the final king, and he shows up here in 2 Kings 17. He's the last king of Israel. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He died. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him, put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, in the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. So you have this long history of the northern kingdom that began in 931 BC, and it falls in 722. So about 209 years is all that the northern kingdom of Israel exists for. And in that time, there were 19 kings that reigned. They represented 9 ruling families. 8 kings were either assassinated or committed suicide. Not one of the 19 was considered good by God, because each followed either substitute worship at the golden calf centers that Jeroboam put in place, or they worshiped the cult of Baal. And so God's blessing was withheld. Through Elijah and Elisha, warning was given to the house of Omri, but they didn't listen. And so at the end, you have Amos and Hosea warning the house of Jehu, even during the prosperous days of Jeroboam II, for the gross wickedness. I mean, and God extended grace, but at the end of the day, they continued their false worship, and so they went into exile. And the northern kingdom only lasted 200 years. Why? Well, because they worshiped false gods. They did not hold fast to their faith. and that's why they were ultimately exiled, and that's why things fell apart. Um, for the sake of power, for the sake of political power, uh, the first king of the north, Jeroboam, institutes false worship, and the whole thing goes sideways. So, I think there's some lessons that we can learn from that. That political power needs to not be the center and the focus of our attention, and especially political power cannot take away from our religious faithfulness, because when we start going down that road, man, bad things happen. So that's the story of the kingdom of the north. Um, do you have a like less than 100 questions? Um,
No.
maybe we can. If you have a couple of questions, maybe we can answer a couple of them really quick before we wrap this up. And if not, that's okay too.
This is the easy one. How many
Yeah.
kings did you say either committed suicide or were assassinated?
8.
Okay.
Yep, 8 kings were either assassinated or committed suicide. Of the 19, I mean, do the math on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, whew, almost half.
Yeah.
I guess I never thought about the fact that there wasn't anything good happening in the Northern Kingdom at all. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just pure evil.
Yeah.
But I just have, this is an important question, but where was Samaria located exactly?
Yeah, so let me pull up. Let me look here. I've got a map in front of me. Let's see if I can put my finger right on it. So it was all right, so it's Samaria is kind of in the it's kind of in the northwest. Like it's south of Galilee, right, where Jesus spent most of his time. The Sea of Galilee is in the north, and then and so that's why Jesus was always kind of having to go, around Samaria. So there was kind of in the central west, I guess you could say. So like west of the Jordan River, between the Mediterranean Sea, just slightly north of Shechem, is which again is it's west of the Jordan River, north of the Dead Sea. So if that helps any.
What tribe would that have been originally?
Well, the area would have been Ephraim.
Okay.
Yeah, it would have been in the Ephraim territory.
Just a curiosity.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And he was one of the two that was for Joseph, right?
Correct. Yep.
And Manasseh?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so that whole area there, is, I mean, that's where so Shechem is in Manasseh. Megiddo is in Manasseh. Bethel is in the southern edge of Ephraim, right? So I remember Manasseh is the only tribe that had land on both sides of the Jordan. So so in the north, if you work your way down, like from north kind of to south, you have Asher in the top kind of northwest. Then you have Naphtali right to the east of it. Then directly south, you have Zebulun and Issachar. And then you have Manasseh that runs all the way across there in the middle. And then you have to kind of the south, the southern edge of Manasseh. hits Ephraim. Immediately to the west of Ephraim is Dan, which goes up to the Mediterranean and Joppa. And then kind of directly below Ephraim is Benjamin. And then underneath that, south of that, is Judah. And within Judah is Simeon. And then to the east of Judah, across the Dead Sea, is Reuben. And then just north, working your way back up, just north of Reuben is Gad. So that's kind of the way that lays itself out.
As we're going through, and it's like each king was worse than the one before.
Yeah.
And, you're thinking how long God let this go on.
Mm-hmm.
That he just didn't zap them right away. He allowed the evil to continue to grow and grow. And then you look at the world today and you think, well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and this is why, guys like, I think we talked about it last time, right? This idea that when God wants to judge a nation, he gives them a bad leader.
Yeah.
And allows a bad leader. And so, or a bad ruler. And that's, they had their chance. Like, Jeroboam, if he had just trusted that the people could have gone and worshiped at the temple, maybe they wouldn't have had all those problems, right? But God in his grace gave them all kinds of chances, not to mention all the prophets that are prophesying during this time, right? And they're calling them back to faith. They're calling them back to live a life and to have a level of trust that he wanted from them. And so it's this, it's 200 years, but all the way through there, you see those moments of grace kind of punctuated. Mm-hmm. And it really does. It really is a testament to God's, his long suffering, his patience, his kindness. I think this helps us understand when Paul says in Romans, your kindness leads to repentance, right? So.
But didn't they suffer tremendously by the Assyrians? The Assyrians were so cruel, weren't they?
They were.
They really suffered under them.
Yeah. Oh, they suffered horribly under the Assyrians. The Assyrians were brutal.
Right.
And part of the reality is, Dorothy, too, is that, the normal people, right? The blue collar guys, so to speak, during this time suffered under their own kings. The people of Israel were suffering under their own kings.
Yeah.
Which is why we got into this mess, right? Because Solomon had exacted such heavy taxes and in conscripted labor that you had a civil war break out. It's these, you can take the lessons from these stories and you can see them playing out to today, right? You can draw all kinds of parallels.
Yeah, that's what's been going through my mind.
Yeah, mine too.
Boy, they were so terrible, but yet God still endured them and blessed them and had grace. And then you think about what's going on in the world today, not just in our country, but in the world.
All over.
Yeah.
All over. And it's amazing.
All over. It really is.
Who was really the prophet that was in a tree hiding and Jezebel had the tree sawed in half? I can't remember the name of it was, but I remember that. But it's unusual. You got somebody like Jezebel who was so evil, but her name is remembered now. People that do bad things are a Jezebel.
Right.
To be remembered that way for years and years or something. And then Jehu, if somebody drives her crazy, they call him a Jehu,
Yep.
So it's interesting how these stories carry on and we relate to them in different ways now.
Absolutely.
Can we, I know we don't assume, but can we, other than the prophets, were there people that were still faithful to God?
Oh, I think we can assume that, right? I think, even as you look at, especially when you read through like some of Elijah's interactions. So, yeah. But this also, it's also a good reminder though, that even though there is a remnant, even though there is,
Mhm.
there's still this reality of the larger community and what, kind of what one, we all have an impact on one another.
Right.
So, it's kind of like today where, there are certain Christian subgroups or subcultures that seem to shape and color all Christians, and that's hard. That's hard for people who are like, but I'm not like that. Like, well, but they have the same name. So,
Yeah.
we have to figure out, how do we, in a sense, how do we clean up our own house? How do we, you know, how do we help change some of that? And, that's part of our responsibility, just like it was probably that remnant's responsibility to try to pull more and more back. Right. And to try to help lead more people towards a proper and right worship. But by the time Jesus comes around, the Samaritans, they were worshiping on their own hill. And so the religious corruption that began with Jeroboam, extended even through the exile and all the way back until the people started coming back to Samaria. So it's pretty wild.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being on. And
Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank
So
you.
I'm gonna wrap up the recording here. And for those of you that are listening later, just know you missed some really fun conversations before and some fun conversation probably after. So let me know if you want to have the information, and I will make sure that you get on this Zoom recording as well. Until next week, love well.